Welcome to the Emotional Balance Sheet, the go-to podcast for parents with multiple kids, especially those with twins, triplets, or more, who are navigating the maze of modern family life and personal finance. Whether you're overwhelmed by education or retirement planning, parenting dilemmas, career transitions, or trying to define your purpose and plan, we're here to guide you with empathy, encouragement, and expertise. Hosted by Paul Fenner, founder of Tama Capital, a certified financial planner and parent to 4 kids, including a set of triplets. Our podcast is your ally in the quest for financial peace of mind, proving that money matters, but family comes first. Subscribe now and join our community of empowered parents at tamacapital.com. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon for investment decisions. Clients of Tama may retain positions in the securities discussed in this podcast.
What does comprehensive financial planning even mean? At Tama Capital, it means a family office where lifestyle planning such as retirement, college, portfolio management, and tax prep and planning are all under one umbrella. But it goes beyond numbers. We focus as much on the emotional side of financial planning as we do on the financial side. We get you. We understand your challenges of building a family, business or career, and a healthy life. We are devoted to wealth planning for families like yours because we are you. Learn how our family can help your family by visiting tamacapital.com. Every day, we are surrounded by our emotions. But how can we use our emotions as information rather than be bullied by them? Our resident therapist expert, Dr. Jennifer Dragonette, joins us once again to discuss this concept of emotions as information as we explore how our feelings significantly impact our financial decisions, careers, and overall life choices. Dr. Jen shares practical techniques to navigate powerful emotions like fear and anger, emphasizing the importance of mindfulness, grounding, and really understanding our values. She also introduces the concept of agency, which helps us recognize that we have more control over our lives than we might realize. Whether you're dealing with a career setback, relationship challenges, or just seeking to improve your emotional intelligence, this conversation offers valuable insights and actionable advice. We also highlight the crucial role of a supportive inner circle and how to effectively utilize our emotions to make better decisions and move forward. Please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Jennifer Dragonette. Well, Dr. Jen, welcome back. I think that's how we're going to introduce you these days, Dr. Jen.
Sounds good. That's me.
So one of the things that I wanted to talk about or have a focus of conversation today is on emotions and emotions as information. Because as we know, emotions drive our financial decisions drive our emotions. But one of the things that has points of conversation that have come up during my strategic reviews with the families I work with over the last 3 or 4 weeks during planning season has been that people I don't think realize how much control or how much power they have over their current situations or lives. And that could be many things. A lot of what I've been talking with people about, or they've been talking to me about, I should say, is their career or their jobs, maybe some of the relationships, but really centered on like, I don't know what to do. I feel like I don't have any good options and really feeling down. And ironically, I just got off a call with somebody that had been surprisingly released, big layoff from his company. And so, that just really hit home. So I wanted to maybe set things up this way and have you lead in with your expertise on how people can really not like fall into the doldrums and realize that they do have more power and control over their emotions and their lives, and how to take what they're feeling from an emotional standpoint and how to deal with that.
Mm-hmm. It's a great topic, and it's one that's so overarching. It's finance, it's how we feel as parents, as partners, as friends, as humans in the world. And so much of the time we feel like we're subject to our emotions, that our emotions are just happening to us, or we're kind of hostage to them almost. And so I say that all the time in my own therapy sessions, which is feelings are just information. And if we can look at it like that, it does give us a little bit more agency and control. So I often think of it as though our feelings are like our two hands that we can often have just right up in front of our face. If you imagine just kind of holding your hands together and putting them right in front of your eyes, that's often how we feel when we're having a big emotion. Let's say it's anger or fear, what we think of as like, quote, negative emotions, because they don't feel great. They're really trying to get our attention. So let's say, a big layoff happens, and that's going to bring up a lot of those emotions. It's going to bring up fear for sure, my security, probably anger. Is that fair? And if those emotions are right up in front of our face, we can't really see past them. We're just stuck in them. And so we can feel like that spin, what's going to happen? We get the what ifs. Often when we're spinning around on those questions or that shouldn't have happened, we can get really stuck on the shoulds. What that says is that we're having emotions, but we're not really looking at them to see what is this emotion saying to us. So I like to take that image of the emotions like our hands and just imagine that we pull back from them even a couple of inches. They're still there. The anger and the fear is still right in front of our face, but it's not blocking our view anymore. We can pull back and look at it and say, okay, so what is this emotion trying to tell me? Then we can do something with it. So let's take the emotion of fear in that situation with a layoff, because I imagine most humans would have some fear if all of a sudden they thought they had a job forever or until they decided to leave and then that's taken away from them. It's going to bring up some fear. So if we pull back from the fear and say, wow, I'm noticing that I'm afraid, that in and of itself is so different than I'm scared, right? I'm noticing that I'm afraid. Now what? What is that fear trying to tell me? Is it trying to tell me that I'm afraid I can't support my family? Is it trying to tell me that I need to start looking for a different job? Is it trying to tell me that I want to reinvest in myself and get a different degree or choose a different path? We can't access any of that information until we see it as information. And sometimes the fear is just, it stops us in our tracks. We just can't move. So the other thing I think of in terms of feelings being information is that we can take those feelings and do what we call opposite action. Typically, if we're feeling really stuck with an emotion that we think of as negative, it's got some urges attached to it. Fear has the urge to just freeze, right? If we're terribly afraid, and often this happens after a layoff, we just hide for a couple days, right? We just stop moving. Or if we're really angry, we might lash out or yell or do something we regret because it's impulsive. But that action urge associated with anger is to attack. And so I like to say, if we can think of our feelings as just information, if we can really pull back from them, we can do that line of inquiry. What is this feeling trying to tell me to do? And maybe I can do the opposite. If I'm afraid and that feeling is telling me to go hide under my blankets, maybe I can start reaching out to my network and saying, hey, friends, this is hard to say, but I've been laid off. Or maybe I reach out to old mentors and say, hey, can you put in a good word for me? But we can't do that until we recognize what we're feeling and what we need to do next. So that information becomes really important.
I think one of the key points I took out of that is, and having been through this, like having been through restructuring, I can relate and can empathize with this individual. And I think as humans, we want to try to bury or suppress those emotions as quickly as possible because they're painful. But yet, when we do that, I think to what you're pointing out is like we miss out on being able to see them as information and then deciding what we can do about it.
Exactly. And you're putting your finger on something really important, Paul, which is this: there has to be a balance of acceptance and change. If we don't accept those feelings, if we don't really validate, wow, this is so scary, we can't do anything about it. And we don't want those feelings. We'll try to negate them. Or, no, I'm okay, I'm fine, right? We hear people say that all the time, I'm fine. What's often happening is there are big emotions in the shadows right behind them, and we're just kind of ignoring them or denying them. It doesn't mean we're not feeling them. So we're having the impact of those emotions, but we're not getting the information that we need. So validation and acceptance, it doesn't mean that we like it. It doesn't mean that we like, being laid off or being afraid or being angry or feeling violated. And we have to acknowledge that it's happening. And so with validation, I really work hard, in myself and with my clients to start saying, okay, it makes sense that you feel that way. Right. And that's really powerful to say to ourselves. It makes sense that I'm feeling scared. Anybody would feel scared right now. It makes sense that I'm feeling angry. It makes sense that I'm feeling sad. And what do I want to do with that feeling? When we can do both of those, then we have agency. Acceptance without change is we're just stuck. And change without that validation or acceptance feels really invalidating. And it feels like, oh, just get over it and move on. We don't do very well in those situations either. So we really need to do both.
You've mentioned that word agency now twice. Can you define that or help us get our arms wrapped around that? Because I'm not sure if everyone will know what you mean by agency.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I deliberately use the word agency rather than control because I think we kind of think of control as a bad word sometimes. Although, in many ways, control is what we all want to do. However, when we're trying to control, it's like this kind of rigid, I don't accept things the way they are. I want them to be different. I think of agency as, that way that we can take on, all right, I choose my next steps. I choose my next behavior. I choose what I do with this feeling, kind of putting ourselves in that witness observer self where we are the drivers of our own bus. Yes, we have passengers on our bus that might be saying, but this is scary, or that's wrong, or don't do that. And the agency is remembering I'm driving my bus, right? You voices and you worries and concerns can come with me. And at the end of the day, I'm deciding where this bus goes, this bus of me, this bus of my life. So agency is remembering that we're in the driver's seat, and that really, we can take that mentality that life is happening to us, but then we don't have that control. We don't have that ability to decide what's next for us. So you asked about, in the situation of a layoff, or, how do we have more power than we realize? And I think it's that idea of stepping back into our own shoes and recognizing that, it's a both and. Again, we may not have chosen all of the situations and events that led up to whatever we're experiencing, and we're the only one that can do anything about it. And that second piece is where the agency comes in.
Is that, I would think that has to be applicable not only for career decisions, but relationships decisions as well. Because when you were saying that, I'm thinking like back to my own work with my therapist, and this, she calls it inner locus of control, like being able to realize that you do have agency, the word she uses quite often as well, versus using that word control. And again, so much of this is awareness. Can you stop and be aware? And ironically, like there's a spot in my house. I don't know how this story is going to land, but there's a spot in my house where I remember going through a very low point with my corporate career and going to that spot and feeling like, okay, this I felt like this was the absolute rock bottom. And I went to that spot yesterday, and I don't know why. And I stood there and I basically told myself, even back then, and this was like 8 years ago, 8 years ago, myself, my family, we had a lot to be thankful for back then. And I'm looking around and my house looks nothing like it did back then. Like my financial situation looks nothing like it does back then. My business looks nothing like it did back then. And I just in that moment thought and said out loud, I'm like, I'm so fortunate that I didn't get stuck here and that I missed everything that has happened to me over the last 8 years.
Yeah, I think that actually is a great way of thinking that, I know you're talking about a literal physical spot in your house, but we do that internally too. We can have these markers or these images of that low point or that moment when we just got overwhelmed by whatever emotions were happening, or, maybe the fear thoughts came in and we started believing them. So I think it's a beautiful thing to return to that spot and recognize, wow, things are really different. And that didn't just happen. And that's really what I mean by agency, that we can get so stuck that it can start to feel like that's the only room you can ever be in again. That's the only spot that you're going to get to exist in. And it's just not true. And, of course, there are layers, and certain people don't have all of the options or privilege to do everything that we want to do. And even within, restrictions or, certain challenges that we have, we always have more choices than we think we do. And sometimes that choice is just to keep moving, in the direction of what's important to you, even with all of those emotions that are flooding or saying, no, you can't, or, no, you're the one who is not going to be, everybody else can do this, but you can't do it. Those emotions, they can come with some pretty harsh messages. And then, that idea of pulling back from those emotions, we get to look at that and say, is that accurate? Because when we're at a low point, a layoff or business challenges or whatever's impacting us, if we go to that, physical or metaphorical spot in your house where it just feels like things are crashing down, there's messages in those emotions, right? You're not good enough. You're not going to be able to do this. It's like those old messages we've been carrying around for decades. Who do you think you are to think you can choose a career that you love, right? And we'll believe those messages if we're not careful, if we don't pull back from them enough to notice that they're even being said. And I'm not talking about, hearing voices or being said by someone literal, but sometimes we'll just talk to ourselves that way. Oh, who do you think you are to choose a life that's meaningful? Or who do you think you get to have, a family and a career? And we get these challenges and these doubts that are attached to those feelings. And so when I talk about agency, part of agency is just internal, recognizing, oh, I'm talking to myself in such a harsh voice today. Or, when have I felt like this before? Oh my goodness, this is a really old feeling. This isn't just today, right? So then we can do something. We can say, okay, I don't really believe that anymore. Or I do, and I need help moving through this. I need to reach out for support. I need to call in my network, call in my advisors, or maybe I need to just give myself some time to feel this feeling and then keep moving, even if that feeling is with me.
What is the action item? And I know this is a loaded question, but what is the action item that allows you to, after like knowing like, okay, I'm experiencing this emotion, whether it's fear, anxiety, I'm having like inside out two thoughts, like all the emotions.
Yeah.
Once you experience it, how are you able to say, okay, I feel this, but now I need to do the next step. I need to take the next step. Like how can you make that pivot, or what are some things? 'Cause I've often read or researched sensory things like touching something, or like right now, obviously the podcast listeners, those on YouTube could see me moving my fingers and like touching my fingers together, like something like physical that makes you kind of your mind step out and say, okay, it's time to move forward. I think you use that example like when you feel like you just want to pull the covers back over you, but you really need to move out. Like, I think that's a struggle that probably all of us have, but don't necessarily know like how to make that pivot.
Yeah, a lot of what you're talking about is mindfulness and kind of grounding. And I think that's a really good approach. What I'm talking about, this pulling back from emotions, that's mindfulness. That's paying attention in the present moment, non-judgmentally to what's actually happening. And that's harder than it sounds, especially when you're in that moment or you're really caught up in emotion. It's like, but that's not fair, or this is happening. We just, all those voices. And so it really does take that mindfulness and sometimes real physical grounding, like scrunch your toes up in your shoes and feel that feeling, or grip the chair and notice that sensation, or look around the room and notice all the colors you can see, just to ground back into that moment. Like, oh, actually, I just went on a whole trip in my head, but I'm still here in this moment. So I think that's a really good first step, is just, okay, where am I? Where are my feet right now? What am I actually doing? Okay, I'm here. I'm safe now. Because typically in the moment, we're okay. For all the listeners out there, if we really just stop and think, in this exact moment that I'm in, am I safe? Probably, right? Am I okay? I probably am right now. It's when I start thinking about the future, oh, but I won't be. Or I start thinking about the past, oh, but I wasn't safe. But we are now. So that's a really important first step, is just recognizing, okay, nothing bad is happening right now. I can take the time, I can take that 0.2 seconds to pull back from that emotion and really notice what I am feeling. Right? So there's these kind of first steps. Where am I now? What am I feeling? Can I make sense of that feeling? Can I validate myself? Say, this makes sense that I'm feeling this. What do I do next? Because that's where we start to get that internal locus of control, like your therapist talks about, that I'm doing this for me, not because someone's telling me to. And then you asked about, okay, so how do we make that next step? How do we move forward? What I like to think of it is, what are my values? And at some point on the podcast, we could even do a values exercise to show people how to really hone in on those.
I'm smiling because that is something I talk about talking about making pivots. That's a major pivot that I've done within the firm and the families I work with probably over the last 3 or 4 years, is to get people centered or focused on what is their purpose or purposes, and then what are their supporting objectives that they want to do to achieve that purpose. And that purpose, 8, 9 times out of 10, is non-financial. Their feelings. And so I knew we were going to get to this eventually, but yeah, that'll be another conversation for us in the future to have.
Yeah, I really love how you approach this because it's exactly how I think of it too. We're just in these different worlds. Because I think if we know what our values are, and they can shift and change, it's good to check in on them periodically. Is that still my top value? Or are these domains the most important things to me? When we know what's important to us, all we have to do is move in the direction of those values. A value is not a goal, right? If we think of it as like,
yes, that's a very important point, I think.
Right. There's not a checkbox that we got to I have attended to my family. Check. It's not like that. So we're always going to be able to move in the direction of that value. And it can be the tiniest move. It can just be a millimeter in the direction of that value. But that's shift. That's change. That's going to be the thing that starts moving us toward the life, the emotions, the thoughts, and feelings that we really want to be having. So it's really about behaviors. And we're talking about feelings. And then what we do is we move our feet in the direction of what's important to us. We do something with our behaviors to say, okay, I say that my family is my top value. Am I living that way? And what does this layoff bring up for me? Maybe it's showing me that I can pivot and pay more attention to this different value. Maybe this is an opportunity. And I think that's where we start to feel like we have our own personal power back.
I'm not sure. Are you familiar with Dan Sullivan? He's the founder of Strategic Coach. He wrote a book, and I'll put a link to it in the show notes, called The Gap and the Gain. And I probably read that 3 years ago. And it took me long enough in my therapy sessions over years to figure this out. But in reading that one book, it was like the light bulb went off with what you just talked about, is having this vision of the horizon, and the horizon's always moving. You can never get to the horizon, but that doesn't mean that you're not getting better or not accomplishing your objectives or your goals. But I think people think of goals as objectives, and that's not the right way to see it. The way to measure your progress is really only to look back and see how far you've come, because that horizon, as you move forward, is always changing. It's always moving. It's never going to be, it's always out of reach, I should say. Mm-hmm. So I thought that was really interesting. I just wanted to point that out. I think the other topic tied to this that I want to bring up that you had just briefly mentioned, obviously it goes without saying that our inner circle, going through these emotional transitions, if you will, are very important. But one thing that stuck out to me when I was going through my career transition was that the career coach I was working with at the time told all of us, be very careful on who you let into your inner circle. And he said specifically, if you're talking with people that are there and are actually bringing you down, like you're going to them just to vent about how bad your situation is, that's not necessarily a good thing. And I would love to get your thoughts on that, because I think it's can be very overlooked. Like, you're just talking to, your husband, wife, spouse, partner, and sometimes they might not be the best person to talk to.
Yes, it's a really good point. So there are a few things I want to touch on in there. I'll touch on the last part first, which is that, your husband, your spouse. In modern times right now, we are expecting our spouses to be everything for us. It wasn't always that way, right? So currently, our spouse is supposed to be our best friend, our parenting partner, our financial partner, our business partner, our sexual partner, right? It's like, really, how can
That's a lot of hats.
Be all of those things as well as we want them to be? And I do think it's okay to diversify and to have your spouse play some important roles for you. If they're not your best source of emotional support, that's okay. It's okay to have other people. Brene Brown has a really nice approach to this in her book, Dare to Lead, which I like a lot, which is, she calls it the square squad, which is take a 1 by 1 inch square and write in that tiny little square the names of all the people who truly understand you and can support you. And those are the people that you turn to in these hard moments. It's not that many people. We can't fit that many people in a 1 by 1 inch square. And that's on purpose, because we want people, just like you're saying, when we're really down. I have a list of about 5 people who I can turn to, who I can just say, I just really need to vent right now. And they will say, vent away. Or I can say, okay, I really need some advice. They'll say, all right, here's my best advice. But they're going to give me what I need and what I ask for. And I have other people who I love dearly who just can't quite do that. And that's okay. I don't need them for that. So I think it is important to just take some time in a calm place to think, it's not, who's my best friend or who's my favorite person, but who can show up for me in those moments in the way that I need them to. And it might be surprising. Sometimes it's someone who you don't have as much contact with, but they have that ability or that skill to do that validation, say, wow, Paul, that makes sense that you're feeling like that. How can I support you? That's a type of friend that you want to keep close, because we need them. And it feels good to be able to show up for each other that way.
Well, I think that is probably a good place to wrap this conversation as an action item is to, I'll link to Brené's book. I know I have not read it, but it's been on my to-do list, compliments of my wife, Teresa, because I know big Brené Brown fan, but to really look at developing this inner circle. So Dr. Jen, great conversation as always. And again, listeners, if you have questions or topics that you would like us to cover with Dr. Jen, feel free to email those at the show on the website, pfenner@tamacapital.com. And we'll also make sure that we always put a link to Dr. Jen's LinkedIn profile and her contact information as well. But Dr. Jen, thanks again for a wonderful conversation, and we'll see you here in a few more weeks.
All right. Thanks, Paul. See you next month.
You may often hear me talk about or say, our emotional lives drive our financial lives, and our financial lives are driven by emotions. And I think this conversation with Dr. Jen really highlights that point. But the first point I want to come back to is one that we talked about towards the end of the conversation, which is the book I referenced by Dan Sullivan called The Gap and the Gain. And I think Dr. Jen really made a point to emphasize this as well, is that our goals are not our purpose, which is not our values. And this is a concept that I read about through Dan Sullivan probably 3 or 4 years ago that really helped change how I view things. Because the horizon, as Dan Sullivan explains in his book, is always out of reach. It's always changing, and you can never reach it. But that doesn't mean you stop trying. Versus a goal is something that you do achieve, and then you're always looking for what's next. And as Jen and I talked about, that will be a point of conversation in a future episode. One of the other things I really want to get back to that I think is an actionable item is to build a supportive network. Jen referenced the book Dare to Lead by Brené Brown. I've not read that, but I'll put it on my to-do list. But going through an emotional transition, you need to find the right people to be in your inner circle. And sometimes it's not always, as we discussed, your spouse, partner, significant other. Sometimes you need to talk to them about certain things, but then other topics, they're not the right person to talk to. So finding and building that inner circle when going through any kind of life transition, I think is critically important. And then just overall, as Jen emphasized, she used the term agency over and over, of being the driver of our own bus and recognizing and validating our emotions and how we can take control of our actions, and we have more control than we realize. If you've enjoyed this conversation, could you do me a favor? Do you know anyone else who would enjoy these types of conversations where we talk about the intersections of our emotional and financial lives? Because if you do, it's actually going to help both of us. Could you share this conversation with someone? They will think you're great because you just gave them this terrific podcast, and it helps me grow my audience. Or you can tell them to go to tamacapital.com. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.